We're talking about simplifying WCAG or WCAG. I like using the letters. I feel awkward sounding it out like that, but both are totally acceptable. So how the heck do I actually make websites accessible? Making websites in a way that everyone can use them. That sounds like a good thing, right? But what does that actually mean? You know, a quick search on the internet leads to a ton of overwhelming, sometimes conflicting advice and criteria and guidelines, and there's a lot there. So the big question is, do I have to follow every single guideline? How do I know what I can ignore? You can't possibly need to do every single little thing in there, right? Are there things that are just suggestions, maybe that aren't as important or that you don't have to do, maybe best practices, recommendations, nice to haves, all of these sort of buzzwords that we use when we're talking about projects and features. They're all valid questions. We already make trade-offs all the time on projects. Side note, I do want to mention that I'm at Queer Dev Person on most things. That's at the top of the slide. Also, if you want a copy of these slides, it's overnightwebsite.com/WCMC. And if there's any kind of visual things up there that I'm not saying, I will describe what's on the slide. So we already make trade-offs when we're talking about, projects. We push features to a later release. We prioritize certain things. We live with certain bugs just to maybe hit a deadline. Maybe we're considering the resources that we have or a certain budget. Can we apply that same principle to accessibility? Well, at its baseline, accessibility just means making sure people can use your website. There are things that you do to cater to certain audiences when you're creating your website, right? You're designing and creating so that your preferred audience likes it and interacts with it. But accessibility doesn't mean that it's a different audience. It means that you're providing a base level of access where all audiences in all subsets of people can use your site. It's not a thing that you do for your audience and for other people. It's a thing you do for your audience, period. So you sort of have to take the way that you think about accessibility and sort of integrate it with what you're already doing, because that's just the fact of what it is. So technically, the answer to that question is not really. We can't really think about accessibility in the same way that we think of an overall project, because you don't apply the "we'll do this in a later release" to accessibility. It's fundamentally a part of every aspect of your project. Most things that you need to do for accessibility are things that should be happening at all stages of the project. It's not, sorry, I'm using two screens and it's a little disorienting. So most things that you do for accessibility should be happening at all stages of the project, from the beginning throughout the whole thing. So going back and starting at the beginning in a later release just makes it harder on yourself, because it wasn't a priority. And it doesn't just alienate an entire, population of your audience, it makes your job and your team's job a lot more difficult. But surely we don't have to conform to every single guideline, right? So that's back to our original question. WCAG tries to account for as many scenarios as possible. So when we're talking about how you shouldn't delay accessibility as an entire feature, that's how you delay certain accessibility requirements. If you don't have a video, you don't need to worry about captions or transcripts. If you don't have an accordion, you don't have to test, does it work on a keyboard? Does it work on hover? Does it work for screen reader users? If you don't have e-commerce, that's really great, because there's a ton that you need to test there. So it's not that you don't do these things. It's just that you launch using the features that you can complete, right? And then you sort of use these other things for a phase 2. So it's less of an ignore and more, if we've already considered this, we don't need to worry about it. So that's number 2. So our first one, to bring a little clarity, anything that doesn't apply to your project, right? So those videos, those things that you're not including, you don't need to worry about, because it's not part of it. So you immediately sort of remove those things. That brings you to your sort of updated WCAG list. Anything that you've already considered. So for example, when you're doing branding, that's when you should be thinking about colors, color contrast. What's our font color and our background color, and what kind of variations can we use? Is our logo going to have a light and a dark mode? All of these sort of color contrast things, if you think about in the beginning, now you don't have to consider it when you're designing and developing the website because you have the brand guideline. So again, it's not that you're not considering these WCAG things. It's not that you're ignoring it, but you're spreading it out amongst all these other things, and you're improving accessibility, usability, all of those things. And then all of those depends scenarios, right? So all of that conflicting advice and use your best judgment, all of those things that are kind of in the gray zone. Again, not ignoring it, but just using your best judgment. So as long as you're making the best decision at the time that you have, that's what's important. You're going to want to keep an eye on suggestions and the evolution of these things. But for example, one that came up in a Facebook group I'm in is you have the button block, right? You have these group of buttons, but technically a list of links should be in a list so that somebody using a screen reader can know how many links are there, they can skip over it. So if there are a group of links that are related to each other, you can just skip over them if you're not interested. And then you can style it how you need to. You can remove the bullet points, make them look however you want. But the block editor, the buttons block doesn't mark it up in a list because I think it's sort of implied that you're not going to have more than a few buttons. That starts to get a little unwieldy. But so how many links is the limit, right? Is it 3? Is it 2? Is it 1? Is it 4? There's no hard and fast rules. So again, it's not that you're ignoring the links should be in a list. It's just that you're using your best judgment. And so if you only have a few links and it's not a big deal, no one's really had any complaints, you can kind of skip over that one. Another example would be, ideally there should be some text between your headers, right? So you have your H1, your page heading, and then you have some text, and then you have an H2, maybe some, so there should be text in between those. But there are situations where maybe there's a heading that follows another heading right away. Is that a violation? No. So you can sort of prioritize certain things, and as long as you're doing your best with what you've got, there are certain things that you can make concessions on. The other one would be that pattern that we see when you have that really big header with that sort of tagline at the top. That's a really common pattern that's a little bit more of a you can do it in a few ways scenario. So ideally you'd have the order on the page in your HTML be the same as somebody who's using a screen reader or tabbing through. It should all be the same, right? But that would mean that your tiny header is like your H1 or H2, and then you have this big header that would be a paragraph, and you just style them appropriately. And sometimes that matches the pattern, right? Sometimes we have, about, and then you have the big text that says, learn about our team. And so that would be a little bit more along the lines of heading and paragraphs styled differently. But what if the big one says about and the little one says, learn about our team? Well, then you're sort of taking things out of order. And so somebody who's using a screen reader would ideally have the header and then the text. And so you're sort of sacrificing that, making the DOM order match for the ease of use and ease of understanding. And so you use that CSS to sort of flip things around so that you keep that heading order, because that's what's most important. Because when we're looking at it visually, we typically will look at that big header and then that little, text above it. So you're sort of following the same thing that we do visually with the text, but you're sort of sacrificing that, criteria and, having a minor sort of violation. So again, it's not that you're ignoring the guideline, it's just that you're using your best judgment based on the situation. With all of these things, it's important to remember that if you are genuinely doing your best and continuing to try to make the experience as accessible as possible, that's going to take you really far in this process. A lot of times people in the accessibility community, we come across the same issues all the time, or we get really frustrated by a certain thing because we're sort of in this world all the time. And so it's really easy for us to be like, oh, can you just put the headings in the right order? Or can you? And so, to borrow sort of a phrase, it's progress over perfection, right? So you're sort of doing your best and being open to hearing about what you can do to improve. So let's move on to some actual practical methods for implementing accessibility. This is all important, right? They're all there for a reason, all of those individual criteria. But how do you prioritize what to do first? Well, as I mentioned earlier, you start with accessibility. In an ideal world, you don't have to prioritize because you're handling it as each part of each piece of the project. You won't have to launch first, fix later. It's already accessible. So in these instances, when you sort of have the ideal scenario, you're developing the website, you have total control. Make it easier on yourself and your team and create processes to help you. You're not going to have a process right off the bat. You're going to have to learn. You're going to have to explore. You're going to have to, spend some time just gathering as much as you can, doing things here and there. And then as you get familiar with these things, then you can add them into your processes on a more, permanent basis as you find out where they fit in the process. You already have processes when you're creating websites, right? You get the branding done, you get the content, maybe the content happens at the same time as the design, since most of the time that's the piece that takes the longest, and so you have these processes in place. Just fit the things that you already do in with the accessibility. So for example, during your content step, what are the heading levels? Where's the paragraphs? What can be split up into lists or things that are a little more visual? Make notes about your content for the people who are inputting that content. And again, you're separating this out and spreading it out. And you're not only making it more accessible, you're making it better overall. We don't always have the ideal scenario, right? So we're building a new site, great, we get to do what we want. But what about when the site already exists? Or what about when you're part of a larger team that you don't necessarily have control over everything and it's a little bit fragmented? How do you make progress towards accessibility in these cases? How do you know what you can ignore in favor of making progress? So temporarily ignore. Apply your process where you can. There's going to be things that you're already doing that you're going to be able to just fit in really seamlessly, like that content step, for example. Maybe take the content and run it through, a reading level analyzer that'll tell you, and then you can sort of rewrite the content so that it's easier to understand. There's things that you're going to be able to incorporate right away. The other thing is quick wins. There are things that are a little bit easier to implement that you can do, like the heading order, or changing a link color, or making sure that you have a focus state. There's things that you can do that are a little bit easier to do globally throughout the site, maybe things in the header or the footer that are going to just be easier to implement because it's global, right? What can certain automatic scanners pick up? There are things that will scan your site and give you a report, and then you'll be able to just sort of go in and figure out what you can fix and just do it really quickly, right? What can you do that's going to impact the most users? You're maybe not be able to account for everybody, but what are most people going to need? So like color contrast, we can all use that. So then you take it there to manual testing, and then to anything you have to redevelop or restyle or replace. So those things, you sort of do it in a sort of, I don't know if it's a pyramid, but you do it in a way that sort of makes sense, right? There's nothing that says making a little bit of progress is not worth anything. It's all about progress. And then, always be testing. So just like in all of these other things, we test on mobile, we test on different devices, we test on scenarios, all of these things, you also just test for accessibility as often as you can. And so that's something else to fit into your process, and that's gonna help you, every time you run a test, fix a thing, right? Make a little rule for yourself, and then like those 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes add up to a lot of consideration for these things. There are some tools that can help you simplify this process. You don't just have to go read the docs and figure it out yourself. I'm a pretty big fan of these tools. They all have pros and cons, but they're gonna sort of help you narrow down your scope or your focus. This isn't an exhaustive list of all the tools, but they are things that you can use to inform how you go about analyzing your site. I have a list of automatic scanners at the end, but I've split it up into 3 different categories. So the thing about some of these is, I'll go through them and I'll point out the things individually. So if we start at the beginner level, these have great organization and explanations. They're not as complete. They're more like a basic checklist. They don't really necessarily identify things as clearly, but it's a really great place to start to get some of those easy wins, to get some of those easier to understand things. So webaccessibilitychecklist.com. the screenshot there gives you an example of, they actually give you a really clear sort of description. Sometimes the WCAG, criteria on the, W3 website is a little bit confusing or technical. So this website, the things that they do have, they give you a really clear description of how to do the thing, what it means. They'll give you some examples when they apply, and they give you really helpful links. So I do like that about this one. And then also in the beginner sort of level, you have a11yproject.com/checklist. It doesn't have a ton of info for each of the ones. This screenshot gives you an example. It gives you kind of an easy to understand description at the top, like sentence. It gives you the WCAG actual criteria that you can link to. And then it sort of gives you, so it's like, it's brief, but it doesn't have a lot of helpful links, but it is, again, it's a little bit more, it gives a little bit more criteria than the first one. So I would sort of take a look. The thing about these tools is you kind of want to just take a look at all of them and see which one speaks to you the most, right? Everyone's going to have different preferences and things that are going to be clear to them. So these two are great. They're simple. This one's kind of neat. The accessibility, the a11yproject.com/checklist. It's a persistent checklist. So as long as you keep your cookies around, you can check stuff off and you can refresh the page and it'll stay. So that's kind of neat. I like that a lot. At the moderate level, these are things that you really kind of need a base level of understanding for what some of these terms are. Maybe somebody who can help you sort of decipher some of these things. Some of them are going to be easy to understand, like, heading levels and keeping the heading level order. And then some of them are going to be a little more technical. Like they go into certain like iframe attributes and, language attributes and certain things that like you might not really understand if you don't know a lot about, the code side of things. So these are moderate level where once you have some experience with accessibility and making things accessible, you can maybe start to dive a little bit deeper. So the first one here is, this is WCAG.com. These are both going to have like different filters, which is really nice. Help you narrow things down a little bit. It's a lot to go through manually, even when you filter. So that's why, again, these are sort of, once you've done your first pass, then you can sort of use these tools. Each of the aspects of the individual criteria for this is WCAG.com, they've split it up into like, so you can see in the screenshot here, you have 1.1.1 3 times. It's actually there a bunch more than that. So they split everything out, which is nice, but again, that makes it a lot to go through. But what's really nice is that column all the way at the end is the category, and so they have that quick win tag that you can take a look at and filter through. So again, easy things that you can do, like adding some alt text to your images that aren't decorative. The second one in this category is not-checklist.intopia.digital. I always add an O in that. This one is, again, it has those filters. The filter is a lot more user-friendly. This is more like a designer made this one, a developer made the other one. So this one, I like the one before this one. That's a little more developer-focused because I'm a developer, but this one is really easy to understand, and I really like the fact that they've broken things down into roles. So if you're focused on content, if you're focused on UX, if you're focused on a developer. So the drawback to that is that things do repeat because they've broken it out into these things, and they, want to make sure that if something applies to both roles, then they both see it. There's also some items that they give you that don't have a criteria attached to it. I'm not sure why. These are things that are good to do, and so I know why it's there, but like, I don't know why they don't have it paired. So it's, they've made decisions, which is fine. Again, this one repeats a little bit, like I said. It's actually not updated to 2.2, which isn't as big of a deal for like any kind of, compliance. I use that air quotes with the word compliance, but because a lot of times you sort of have to conform with 2.1 rather than 2.2. 2.2 added a few things, but I do like that the one before this one had everything that's most up to date. And then our last one is kind of an interesting tool. It lets you create your own list. So this is sort of an alternative type of tool. and it assumes a really high level of understanding. This is actually made, I think it said it was by T-Mobile, hence the sort of magenta. So it's magenta.a11y.com/web. It's basically for putting together testing criteria. So if you wanted to try it out, I haven't actually played around with this one as much, but you basically check what's on the left of what you need, and then on the right, it sort of spits out this testing criteria step by step of what you should be doing and what you would need to do to have this pass. And then at the bottom, it gives you full information, and that's a really helpful link for each one of these, because then it goes into even more detail. But this is really, really developer focused almost, where the links that they give you are going to go into a lot of detail that if you don't know or have a background in this, it's probably going to be a little bit harder to understand. But it's really cool to check out. All of these things are free. There's no limits because you're not like automatically scanning anything. But so this one's, it's kind of cool. Yeah, and then it has, I tried to Google what gherkin meant. I think it's just a type of testing. It might have something to do with the Scrum in some way or something. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, but so the condensed version is just as good as whatever speaks to you and your team. So those are some really cool tools that you can use to guide you in this process. And so I don't want you to take these and like get overwhelmed by them because there are so many. That's what's really great about the filters. You can sort of take it one at a time. So that's what's the beginner ones, go through, take a look at them, and then the more advanced ones, filter through. You don't have to look at all of them all at once. And then just as a sort of helpful to have, these are sort of the general links. I don't want to read these links out. Again, you can go to overnightwebsite.com/WCMC. I've pulled out the links from this presentation and put them in a list on there so you can click on those. You have like explanations that go into each of the criteria in a lot of depth. You have the WCAG, which is just sort of outlining all of the, the web content accessibility guidelines. And then some examples of ways you can do certain things. It's like different scenarios and things. So those are going to be, sort of your general links and places to start, because that can get really, you can get lost in those docs. There's a lot there to consume. And then finally, in terms of these testing tools, I've created a tool that I'm currently calling the WCAG Accessibility Helper. I don't know if that's going to be the name forever. It's kind of a mouthful. I didn't want to just call it checklist. I don't know what I'm going to call it. I'm not great at naming things. When I would write stories and things, naming characters was the hardest part for me, not the writing part, the naming part. So if anyone has any thoughts on what to call it, that'd be great. But it is a work in progress. I was finishing up the current iteration of it right up until this presentation. So it's a work in progress with a working title that asks questions about the different features that are going to be on your website and pairs up the corresponding criteria. So it's kind of like the filter, but it starts off with eliminating some of the things you don't need. So you're not presented with everything all at once. It takes that concept of the checklists and filterable tables and makes it easier to narrow down what you actually need. I'd love to incorporate some of the things we saw. Again, I'm a developer, so what you're going to see at overnightwebsite.com/WCAG is going to be, pretty plain. It's just a basic form, and then it'll spit out, some really basic, just here's what you need to know, just so that I can get it working, so that, I can have a sort of proof of concept. But I'd love to incorporate some of those filters, some of those concepts that we saw, so that I don't need to recommend 4 different tools for you. I can just recommend one, right? The main goal is to make these requirements easier to understand, to explain them in a way that, explain it to me like I don't have any idea what you're talking about, kind of scenarios, so that it can be a little more approachable as a topic. Sort of like that first tool did, where I showed you it had a really good basic description, and then it had those examples, but sort of expand on that. To also then include some of the more, developer-focused things, or so just sort of use the role-based one that the other tool had. So that's sort of where I'm going with this. Rather than have here's a giant list, now do it all, it's more like presenting the data in 2 ways, right? I want to provide you with the similar thing that we've been looking at with all of these tools, and then also kind of this interesting idea that, so like the WCAG 1.1.1 is going to be the most common. It's going to have a lot of the content-based things. It's the first one. It's going to be like sort of what's most common in all of the websites. And so how many times does that get hit, right? So how many times do your features need to address that one thing? You know, if you have a slider, that's going to impact certain things and certain criteria. And if you have animations, that's also going to hit some of those similar criteria. So this way you can sort of see, you know, this one, 5 of my features need this thing. So I should probably pay attention to what that one means. Whereas, do I need captions? That's just really the videos or audio. So I can, you know, push that aside and let me see what this one's all about, because 5 of my features need this. So let's dig into that. So that's sort of something that I felt was a little bit missing from my brain. I like to organize things in multiple ways. And so it's nice to have these checklists, but I like being able to understand how they all fit together into these sort of criteria in different ways. So it's a work in progress. Like I said, you know, if you want to go on and test it, you're more than welcome. It's really just going to be a thing you can copy and paste. Obviously, I'd love to have different ways to export it, to, you know, do different things with it. So there is, you know, a newsletter sign up that you can do on my website to get informed when this is updated to a more sort of like these other, you know, 5 tools that that I've shown you, when it's a little bit more presentable. But I'd love for anyone who's interested to be involved in the process. This is just going to be a free, you know, tool, just like all these other ones that anybody can use. And so as much input as possible would be, you know, highly welcome. And then so last here we have just some of those automatic scanners, no particular order. These are things that are going to help you take that first step. They're going to be a little more guided. They're going to tell you a little bit more about what you should do. Again, there's a lot on websites that automatic scanners can't pick up, and so that's why familiarizing yourself with these other tools that I mentioned first is going to be important. But this is going to do a little bit of a shortcut to bring you a little bit further in the process. So you have Equalize Digital's plugin, and then when you install the plugin and scan the site, when you have issues, they'll provide you with a link to read more. All of their links are really informative, really just spectacular. So I would highly recommend that. There's a free plugin, there's a paid version. You know, I say no particular order, but obviously that's the first thing that popped in my head, because I'm a big fan. There's Axe DevTools, Accessible Web, Wave, and then there's like little bookmarklets and browser add-ons and different things that you can do that do like pieces, right? You can do like a heading map. Or, you know, there's one that'll like pull out all the different aria that you have and all the landmarks. So there's like pieces that you can, you know, install certain tools for that maybe don't do the whole thing, but do these individual things for you. So those are the places to start for, you know, automatic scanners. Obviously, I'm not including any kind of widgets or anything like that. That's something you can do as a stopgap in the meantime, but ideally, you're going to be just sort of taking this as a more holistic approach and doing the things that you can do. Add your accessibility statement on your website to inform people of the issues that you know about, so they know that you're working on them, and give them a way to contact you. And that's really going to take you, you know, the furthest in this process. It's not something that you should be afraid of or be intimidated by or feel like, well, I'm too busy, I can't do this. Just take, you know, a few minutes whenever you have a moment, and that's really what's going to be the most important. And it's going to show your audience that you care. Like I said, the people who need stuff like this are the people who you're trying to talk to. So there's not 2 audiences here. That should be it for me. Overnightwebsite.com/links. That's what the QR code is going to show you. That's going to give you, there's a link directly to this presentation, some of the other presentations I've done, any other kind of links. And then if anybody has any questions, we have some time for that. Yeah.
In this day and age when a lot of people are, you know, getting their themes from Theme Forest or places like that, you know, themes that they buy or download, like Astra underscores, is there like a rating service? Because you would hope that a lot of these themes have some of these, you your alt tags. Like a good theme should have alt tags, right? So
Yeah.
So do you have like any kind of rating service?
I mean, you can always reach out, and if I know about the theme ahead of time, I can say, yeah, I've used that one and love it, or I can take a look at it and let you know. There are some themes in the theme directory that are tagged with accessibility ready, so that means they're set up. I mean, obviously you can't guarantee that a theme is going to be accessible, because a lot of this stuff is going to be stuff that you're doing to it after you've taken the theme and done stuff with it. So definitely look for the accessibility ready tag in the WordPress theme directory. For these other ones, I mean, if they mention accessibility, that's great. A lot of times I've found that sometimes they'll say that and not 100% understand what that might require, and so they think it is. So just do a quick test. Take some of these things from these tools and run it through. Can you tab through and reach all the stuff? Can you, see, are the colors right? Like if their demo isn't going to be accessible, I don't know that I can necessarily trust that their theme itself is going to be accessible. So there really isn't any kind of like official way to rate these things, but there definitely is ways to test them out.
I just thought that might be good content for your blog. Again,
totally. If you have something that you want to send me, I mean, I feel like I don't know if I'd need permission. I do have a YouTube channel that I do stuff on. It's pretty new, but it is something that I've thought about. There have been like marketing people that'll do like roast my landing page and stuff. I'd love to do stuff like that. I think I want to look into if I need permission from certain places. But if somebody has a product that they want me to look through and do a video on, I could definitely do that. I know that WordPress Accessibility Meetup by Equalize Digital will do some of that, like plugins will volunteer their plugins to get reviewed. So yeah, definitely, for sure. It's definitely a content idea like that. Yeah, what's up?
I'm just curious on like your thoughts on Lighthouse and its like the accessibility score that it provides.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to do some of what those automatic scanners are going to do. I don't know that I would necessarily take it as, if I get 100% accessibility, that means I'm accessible. It's a good goal to have from like an automatic scanner standpoint. They're scanning for things that all these other things scan for. So if you're hitting those marks, that's a good thing, right? You're making sure that it's all working, and that's good. And Google's going to like you for it too. I'm assuming. I don't think we really know what's going on with Google right now, but yeah, I mean, definitely shoot for that for sure. But it also doesn't mean that it's accessible. And having a lower accessibility score doesn't always mean that it's not accessible either, because sometimes there's things that an automatic scanner is going to say, oh, you have this ARIA label, and you really have to just go look at it and make sure it's right. And then you can be like, okay, cool. Yeah, I can, back to the ignoring. What can I ignore? Just check it. And then you're like, oh yeah, no, that's right. That's the way it's supposed to be. And so it's going to maybe flag stuff that is like a false positive kind of thing too. So it's definitely a good tool to use. I've never really liked the way Google presented the info, because I've always found it a little confusing and hard to understand exactly what they want from me. So I'd prefer to use some of these other tools that specialize in accessibility. But yeah, it's a good goal to have. Make it accessible to Google. Sure, why not?
You can get sued for not being accessible.
Can you?
Besides government sites, but like let's say government sites, obviously you can get sued for not being accessible. But what if you're like I actually saw an old person's, retirement community's website,
yeah,
and their fonts look not very politically correct. But
I got you.
The font selector did not work
yeah, well,
so I'm saying, like, what if someone who has vision impaired can't use that?
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of the issues with those widgets come into play. Like I've tried, so I'll sometimes be annoyed by animation on sites. I don't know if it's because I'm on websites all day and so my eyes, I don't know if it's because I have astigmatism, whatever it is, I can be sometimes sensitive to animation. And I'd rather not turn off animation for my whole computer, but I don't want it on this website. And if they have this widget, and also a lot of times I'll try to test it, and it won't pause any of the animations. So some of these widgets that are happening aren't actually doing the thing that it's supposed to, and so it's not addressing your ability to not get sued. Now, in terms of the likelihood of you getting sued, there's going to be certain factors that might make you more likely. Certain states have requirements, like California, if you have like a certain number of like franchise locations and there's like the stigma of like, oh, there's these people that are just going after people to try to get a settlement, and there's all this stuff. I think it's a from a business standpoint, it's good to consider. I don't think that if you are trying your hardest, that you would get sued and it be successful. I think it's, like you said, government. I think e-commerce is another one that's going to be really likely to get you sued. It's basically allowing people the same opportunity to do the same thing. So like if it's a ticket selling, venue, if somebody who can't use the site doesn't have the opportunity and they have to call and then they have to wait and they do these things, they don't get that same opportunity to get this show before it's sold out. So it's those kinds of things where if you're doing that kind of thing, then you're probably going to want to reach out to an accessibility consultant, some kind of team, somebody who's going to help you get there, because that will make you more likely to get the attention of people who can't use your site. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on those kinds of requirements. So
Yeah, I was just curious if you see more lawsuits popping up besides like.
no, I
government
think
accessibility.
Lainey Feingold, I think is how you say her name. She's going to be the one to follow on whatever, her website, her social. She's the one who does a lot in that arena. And so you're going to want to like pay attention to her. She'll do a lot of reporting on, who's getting sued, what kind of lawsuits are out there, how that affects other things. So definitely, look out for those kinds of people that are doing that, because that's where I'm getting my information from too. So you can go right to the source, or, you can, ask me and then I'll, let you know. But yeah, I think it's good to consider, is this something that can get me sued? But I think a lot of times for a lot of people's websites, that's not a likelihood anytime soon. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't then, not consider it. Because again, a lot of this stuff, if you do it in your process, it's going to be really easy to implement.
You're never going to have to worry about it.
Right, you're already doing it, and you're, a year down the road, 6 months down the road, you're going to be like, how did I not even add that to my, it's going to be just another part of your process. So yeah, no, for sure, yeah.
You talked about consultants and stuff. Do you recommend any kind of training program that gets certification within accessibility?
There are some places that have certifications, but it's more like they're certified testers, and then people like me or people like other, agencies or consultants will use them to test the websites, and then we'll sort of take a more sort of project management role, and it's. So there are certifications that you can do. It's a great goal to have. It's not necessarily required to be an expert in the field. You can know what you're doing and, maybe not have some kind of they exist, basically, is what I'm getting at. Yeah, it's worth looking at and seeing if you want to obtain it, if you want to learn about it. It's something you could ask the person that is doing the accessibility testing, are you certified? And then they'll give you an answer, yes, no, I'm looking into it. I wouldn't put too much weight on whether they are certified or not, because it's not necessarily an industry standard. It's like a good thing to have as like an individual who's being employed by a big company who's going to be the person who tests. There's like certain things for like mobile apps and all these different things and all these little levels of things that might not apply to your specific website, but if they're being employed by a bigger company, they're going to be able to do all those things. So like me as an accessibility person, if you're going to come to me and say, I have a web app and can you take a look at it? I'm like, well, I can give you some things, but a lot of that doesn't apply to what my area of expertise is. So, it's definitely a good question to ask, and then just sort of evaluate how the person answers kind of thing. So, yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have any advice for a situation that I constantly run into working with multiple designers and even some devs, where especially with the designers, because I find that there's a disconnect with them that they don't understand accessibility, and I mean it's something I love and want to do on every site I implement, and you get a design, you look at it, and you can see immediately the colors are wrong, the order of the headings and everything. And you try to explain to them, and it's like speaking Greek or something like that. So
Yeah.
do you run into that situation, and how do you get them to like redo their designs, or trying to get them on the same page?
Yeah, I mean, so personally, I have the luxury of choosing who I work with, and finding people that care about making a good website as much as I do. I would say there's a few ways to approach when you have a designer who isn't making things accessible. So you can do, that first approach of like, okay, hey, I realize we haven't had this conversation before, but, here's what's important, here's what I'm gonna want. You lay it out just like any other project requirement, right? I need this website to have a header and a footer and, a sidebar. I also need it to have this level of color contrast. I need the fonts to follow these requirements. You just lay out, and if it's part of your process, you should already have some kind of like little maybe, requirements doc or something like fonts should be a minimum this size, maximum this size, line heights, whatever. So you lay that out and give that as part of your requirements to the designer. And if, whether they care about accessibility or not, they should be following your requirements that you're giving them. That's just part of their job as a designer. So if it's more of a relationship where you kind of, there's another approach where you could take it where if you kind of like their work and maybe they're not responsive and you're in the middle of looking for another designer, you could just take their design and modify it. There's nothing that says, I'm going to take your design and make it as you give it to me. I'm going to make your design and make changes to it in order to build a site that I can be proud of. If it's in a scenario where maybe you're an employee where you're working with other designers who are in the company, that's where it gets a little bit harder. You sort of have to go to some kind of either management level and sort of get more of a buy-in on a higher level. Sometimes you're restricted by that where like it gets to the designer and the content and they haven't considered accessibility yet and things are all over the place and then it's given to you and you're supposed to execute it exactly as it's seen, and if you make any changes then you're going to get in trouble or whatever it is. That's a lot harder of a scenario, and that's up to you how you want to approach that. Do you want to maybe try to go to the individuals and, maybe you want to go to the management and be like, hey, let's have a session, a lunch and learn or whatever on this topic, and, maybe we want to make it important. So there's different scenarios in that, on the easiest way, it's like, hey, let's make things accessible. And if the designer says, no, I love the way I do things, and you say, okay, well, you can go find somebody else to build your websites. That's ideal, right? Like if you're not going to work with me, I'm not going to work with you. On the other side of that is when you don't really have any control, and you don't have to necessarily feel bad about that, right? Like it's going against your nature to want to do the best website you can, but you just do what you can, right? So, yeah, did that answer sort of your?
Yeah, I think you mentioned some good points, but as a designer, they're supposed to come up with the font sizes.
Yeah, well, yeah. So you have
kind of doing their job for them, so.
But having that
in a way,
checklist,
yeah,
your expectations and
it's just like a brand, right? You have a brand guide that they have to follow where here's the logo, here's the colors, here's the font, like a lot of times there's font families. They have to follow these requirements. You're not telling them, like you don't care necessarily what final font they settle on, but at minimum it has to be 16 pixels and at maximum it has to be 24 and the line height has to be minimum 1.5. Like there's just these like guidelines that you give to the project, same as we're making sure that we're talking to our audience about these, service lines, and we want to make sure to highlight these product features. It's just like these like minimum requirements for a project that they then follow and get to be designers within whatever parameters you give them. I mean, if it's a site that's like for you and your friends and no one's going to see it, or if it's like, you can do whatever you want, but like when it's something that somebody's going to, have to go to, then, got to make it something they want to go to. And, you can make something that has 10-point font, but nobody can read it.
The thing is generally like if it's a, let's say, some store, corner store or something, and they come to you and say, hey, can you build this website? They're not going to tell you what font sizes it's going to be, and you're not going to come up with that unless you have a standard for your company, like a base theme or something that you go by. Let's assume you don't. So you hire an expert who is a designer and say, hey, this is the project, this is the store, here's their logo, come up with the concept. So they come up with everything. And then you look at it and you say, oh, this font is too small. I mean, obviously you can change it at that point.
Yeah, you change it, you
But
tell them what you
hire
changed, and
an expert to do it, that's my point.
Yeah, well, everyone should care, right? My talk isn't just for developers, it's not just for project managers, it's for designers, it's for content people, it's all the people should care. And so if you run up against that where the store's coming to you and they're saying, I need a website, and you say, great, I'm gonna go to my designer, we're gonna create something. And then they create something that's got these shortcomings in certain areas. Yeah, so what you do in that scenario is figure out what needs to get changed, make a list. If you're on a tight deadline, just build the site. then go back to the designer and say, here's the things that were about this design that, you know, I don't know if you were aware, you know, it's no big deal, but, you know, I want to have this conversation now so we can prevent this from happening again. So here's the things that were the problems. If you want to, you know, do this in the future, it's got to be at least this. If you want to do this. And so, yeah, you have to do a little bit of that education. And then, so your point was, you know, you don't have maybe a base theme or a base guideline. Well, the things that you're doing to make those changes, now you can start to develop that base guideline, that base theme. So you come across it once, add it to your process. Come across it again, add another thing to your process. This is all just, then you come up with this sort of guideline for projects that you create. Just like any other thing, you know, I want my website to have a mobile menu. Okay, that's part of our process, right? So you add that, and that's another thing that just is part of things. I need a page to have headings. That's just part of the process, right? So it's not something, like I said at the beginning, you're not gonna just snap your fingers and everything's gonna be great. It's a little bit of a process, and it's okay if they didn't get it right? You're gonna let them know that in order for you to have a website that you're gonna be okay with giving to the client, it's gotta fulfill these requirements. And that's it. Yeah. So I think we're coming up on time. I'll be around for the rest of the day. Again, I'm at Queer Dev Person on a lot of things. I think it's Twitter. I don't know if I want to call it X, but I'm on Twitter. I think, you know, on WordPress, I'm that. On Instagram, I'm that. Danielle Zarcaro is Facebook, so, you know, I'm wherever. All those links are there as well. And feel free to hit me up with any questions you have. So.